needs, wants, preferences, even intentional behaviors, these don't cause evolutionary change in a direct sense. They don't alter the genome of the individual, but they do motivate behaviors. And behavior does then function as selection pressure. And so as long as students get the causal arrows right about what motivates what and what creates selection pressure on which levels, students then have a tool for proper thinking about the complex causality here. And a gene-centric focus, therefore, kind of robs them of the opportunity to clarify what is an intuitive and actually maybe not incorrect conception.
Welcome to This View of Life, where we take a deep dive with the best and brightest thinkers on anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am your host, David Sloan Wilson. For more interviews, articles, videos, and special publications, search for This View of Life on your favorite search engine. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, the podcast that studies everything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. And today I am delighted to introduce Susan Hanisch and Dustin Eirdosh. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, David.
Yeah. Hi.
And our topic is evolution education, which in a narrow sense could be thought of as K-12 education, but can also be thought of in a much, much broader sense. And we will do both. And Susie and Dustin are really at the center of education from a modern evolutionary perspective. And that is in contrast to a more traditional form that really focuses just on genetic evolution. And they have written a series of papers. How many is this? Is it 4 papers that you've written?
We've got the published book review, but then we've got 3 preprints available right now as part of a series.
Right, and so this is quite comprehensive, and includes not only evolution education, but they've written a wonderful review of my book, Pro-Social, with Paul Atkins and Stephen C. Hayes, which is more about putting evolution into action than evolution education per se. But we'll be talking about all of these things. To begin, I would like both of you just to describe yourself as human beings and how you ended up in the middle of this wonderful topic of evolution education.
So my background is in education and community development and agricultural science. And it's only been the last about 10 years that I've been really focused on evolution education. I think it was actually a lot of your work, David, that when I started realizing a lot of what I had been doing was education for community development or kind of engaging youth in community issues. And so when I started reading This View of Life and modern perspectives in cultural evolution science, it was just immediately clear to me that this is a game changer, that there's an entirely new way to do interdisciplinary education, and that all of these emerging perspectives have something completely new to offer how we think about scaffolding K-12 education and how we might approach these kind of community issues. And it was really during Susie's PhD that she can describe where we began to develop an educational concept. Maybe do you want to describe?
Yeah, so I'm from Germany. I'm German, and we live in Germany. Actually, we're married, just so that's also clear. And
full disclosure.
Yeah.
And yeah, I actually did my PhD in agricultural science, so like kind of also similar background as Dustin. And we were living in Madagascar at the time, several years ago now, and kind of got frustrated, at least me, kind of with, I get into things thinking, well, this is what the world needs. This is the right thing to do right now. And I was just getting frustrated, and due to Dustin's influence, I was also getting more and more interested in education and then evolution and psychology. And so it kind of just went from there that we were thinking, both in Madagascar, like education is certainly quality of education is an issue. But then also we moved back to Germany and kind of founded an NGO focusing on sustainability education. And then we got into sustainability education, and then we were kind of shocked or confused to find out that sort of many perspectives about human behavior, the evolution of human behavior, and all these things that might matter to understand current sustainability problems and kind of find ways to solve them. There's this huge perspective that's lacking that seems to be lacking in the kind of mainstream sustainability education community. And so we just kind of thought, well, someone's got to do it. And so we just kind of went from there. And since then, we've been kind of focusing on doing that.
And I'll add, so that in the last year, we've joined the newest department of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, the Department of Comparative Cultural Psychology, as the kind of education outreach program for this institute in Leipzig. And so
Right.
we have half of our time sort of focused on our NGO for sustainability education, and half the time working on basically the same project, working to translate the science, the cutting edge of evolutionary anthropology, into teaching materials and teacher training materials.
And that's something, let me say, you've done very well. You have a professional level of knowledge on the extended evolutionary synthesis and all that it represents. So kudos for that. So just a little bit more about your nonprofit before we launch into our subject.
Yeah, so we have it's a Pennsylvania 501c3 called Global ESD. ESD is Education for Sustainable Development, and so we basically developed a novel design, a concept, an educational design concept that looks at sustainability issues, but it looks at them through the lens of human behavior and uses human evolution and cultural evolution as a background for understanding human behavior. We basically make the case that almost any sustainability issue requires groups and groups of people to work together on shared interests. And in that way, we're using a lot of your work on pro-social. Another program that we draw from is the work of Jonathan Haidt and his Open Mind platform to increase intellectual humility on controversial issues. And so we basically try to draw on applied programs in cooperation science or perspectives in moral psychology to give sort of a missing context, what we think is a missing context to education for sustainable development. And then we also do that here in Leipzig as part of a place-based initiative.
Yeah, so this is so fascinating to me. How can I express why it's so fascinating? First of all, let's talk about what we mean by evolution education. There's a narrow sense view, which is like K-12 education. In America, that is centered on just the basic acceptance of evolution, not being in denial about the Darwin's theory of evolution. So in America, we contend with such things as creationism and all that, and we also contend with climate denial. And so the National Center for Science Education, which is the flagship organization that is on the front lines of evolution education, mostly in America, has actually added climate change to its mission. So now it's evolution education and climate change education. And, those things really don't seem to have that much in common other than the fact that they're both forms of science denial. Now, what you have with your organization and what you represent is I would like to call it a parallel universe. And isn't it interesting that you are also dealing with evolution and sustainability, which includes climate change. So that makes you just like the NCSE. But in every other respect, your approach is so very different that if anything deserves the term paradigmatic change, a new paradigm, this does. I mean, literally, as we will discuss, it's going to be very hard for the approach that the NCSE represents, much as I admire it, can transition to the approach that you represent. That's how different it is. And so there's one big piece. Another piece is what do we mean by evolution education? There's K-12 education around the world, so we don't want to Americanize it too much. But then there's the rest of humanity. So there's college education, there's the general public, there's policy experts of all stripes. The fact is that beyond a very sizable, but still in proportional terms, minute community of people who get all of this, then the entire rest of the world needs to be educated about evolution. And part of the problem that must be overcome is that when we say the word evolution, almost the entire world, except for this lucky few, as I'm coming to call them, this community that gets it, the entire world thinks genetic evolution. And so associating evolution with genetic evolution actually is a big part of the problem. We have to begin by defining evolution more broadly than that. That is exactly what has been taking place, and what's so exciting about evolutionary science over the last few decades is that evolutionary scientists, as you know and describe very well, have gone back to basics, and they are now defining evolution in terms of the fundamental ingredients of variation, selection, and replication, no matter what the inheritance mechanism is. And so now evolution includes genetic evolution plus a lot more. That's what's happening in the actual science of evolution that now needs to be reflected in evolution education for everyone, K-12 plus more. Mm-hmm. So I've been talking a lot. Why don't you just reflect on what I said and add your own commentary to it?
Yeah, so let's deal with the American aspect, or we can pull away from the American aspect. So for a moment, so we also have a lot of respect for the NCSE, the National Center for Science Education, but we completely agree with what you just said. And there is this huge gap that seems almost insurmountable. Certainly, it hasn't been in our direct professional interest up until very recently to even try to address this, because it's just not a conversation that's happening in terms of the direction that international evolution education is going. Now, in Germany, we're a little bit different. I'm American. I'm from Philadelphia, but we live here in Leipzig. And in Germany, the situation is a little bit better. The creationism issue is not nearly as fierce, and so emphasis is far less on evolution acceptance and far more on evolution understanding. And there's even here in the state of Saxony, there is, for example, the concept of cultural evolution is officially in the curriculum. But we see a number of issues. So one, textbooks don't give students, and teacher training in biology education most certainly does not give teachers the tools and current perspectives to know what that means, what cultural evolution is, or how it relates to and interacts with biological evolution. And so students may not be able to get, even if they get a quality human evolution education, they're not going to get that piece of it likely. And
that results in people also in Germany, they might accept evolution, but as you said, David, what they hear when they hear evolution, well, it's something with genes, and it's also something from the past. So that's not something that concerns us right now. And so that translates then into a public that doesn't see that evolution is at all relevant to solving, like, to today or to the everyday experience.
And just as a concrete example to make, we've got a 10th grade year here. We did an 18-month teacher researcher collaboration with a 10th grade teacher. And so the 10th grade curriculum in Saxony for biology looks like this. It tells teachers do 50% of the year as genetics, 30% of the year as evolution, and 20% of the year as human evolution. And so teachers frequently interpret that because the textbook is also then laid out that way. The textbook for the year is 50% filled with genetics, 30% filled with evolution, and 20% human evolution. And so that's basically how teachers tend to do it, the teachers that we've talked to, which is numerous. Um, but it need not be that way. And what we're finding is it may actually contribute to student misconceptions. So we were able to do a full school year with our teacher partner, uh, focusing on human evolution from the beginning, because often by the time teachers get to the end of the year, whoops, that 20% turns into 5% or no percent.
And is that in the first place, that is like incredibly enlightened from an American standard, but nevertheless,
Yes.
is not good enough, as we'll get to. The human evolution part, even if they do get to it, is that mostly like human origins, or is it like modern day cultural evolution and stuff?
So it kind of it's a little bit of everything, but mostly origins, and then we get to today's world, and so cultural evolution cycle. It's kind of a quick. It's not very much. It's like 10 pages in the textbook. And so, but students don't get one thing led to another kind of thing is the thing. So they don't really have the ability to connect it to today in a way that seems to be meaningful. And that's kind of what we're trying to, we kind of want to start with, okay, what is it like to be human today? Like, we kind of, when, like in the evolution education community, for example, people know that it seems motivating to connect evolution, content to students' everyday life. But then because people focus just on genetic evolution, then the kinds of things that come up is like, oh, malaria resistance and lactose tolerance.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Right.
well, is that really something that students, are really kind of interested in their everyday lives? Probably not so much. And so if you can find a way to rather talk about, human behavior and language and emotions and, the fact that we like to hang out with friends, if you can make that kind of the thing to be explained, then it seems to be that it's much more motivating, and current evolution understanding allows us to do that.
Yeah.
And if I can just jump in to add, so Susie mentioned lactase persistence or lactose tolerance, right? And this is actually part of so even at the National Center for Science Education, classic evolution educators now accept the evolution of lactose tolerance as a kind of part of the classical canon of evolution education. And this is an instance of gene culture coevolution. But when we've talked to teachers who aren't familiar with the case study, and we ask, how do you think lactose persistence evolved? They'll say, well, genetic mutation. But how would it have function if people aren't able to drink milk? It turns out the evolution of lactase persistence, it's a culture-led gene culture coevolution in which cultural changes, such as perhaps cheese making, perhaps feeding milk to infants that are able to digest it, cultural changes likely preceded genetic changes. And so that's an instance where that's in the classic canon of evolution education. But there's so many more examples where culture-led gene culture coevolution is happening, and the notion of behavior as selection pressure could be a far more general principle that can help resolve students' kind of intuitive conceptions of evolutionary change with the actual current thinking.
Yeah. So absolutely. And so I think my next move I want to make is to from evolution education to evolution science. And for me, it's almost amusing that if you think of teaching all this new stuff in the context of K-12 education, then that's really paradigmatically different in a very practical sense. If you just contemplate how are you going to transition to this new form of education, it almost needs to be like a wholesale change of strategy. It's really hard to see how it could even take place. step was. And then we move into evolutionary science. Then you outline very nicely three traditions, interrelated developments, basically, in evolutionary science. One goes under the name of the extended evolutionary synthesis. The other goes under the name of cultural evolutionary science. And the third goes under the name of contextual behavioral science. And these are historically somewhat different from each other. But when we look at the EES, extended evolutionary science, and the discourse that takes place among the cognoscenti, it is almost comical in the degree of fretting and hand-wringing about whether even as humble a phrase as the extended evolutionary synthesis is warranted. And you have this big camp that says, oh, what we're doing now is different enough that let's just make note of the fact by calling it the extended evolutionary synthesis. And then you get another bunch of people that say, oh, no, let's not do that. And so I find it like stupid. What are your how do you interpret this dynamic of this endless hand wringing over a phrase as judiciously chosen as the extended evolutionary synthesis? And provide some background for our audience. What was the modern evolutionary synthesis, and again, which forms the background for the people who say that there's such a thing as an extended evolutionary synthesis.
Right. So the modern synthesis, the name itself comes from a book by Julian Huxley in the 40s, I think it was, and relates to Darwin knew nothing of genes. With the advent of the discovery of DNA, so many pieces of the evolutionary theory that Darwin didn't know about came into place, and in this way, evolution became gene-centric for a certain large segment of biology, and real progress was made. No one's we love genetics.
Well, I don't love it, yeah, but it certainly has its place.
Yeah.
Some of our best friends are geneticists.
Yes, yes. We have a genetics department at the Max Planck. We get along very well with all of them. But it's about what counts as. So in 2016 we went to the opening event for the EES at the Royal Society, and so we were able to see firsthand the kind of dynamics that you're talking about. One of the tweets from that event was, "Good thing that there's philosophers here to help us understand if we have disagreements." It is mind-bending to try to understand to what degree there's disagreements. In our preprint article, which is geared towards educators, we use a metaphor of porridge. There's a metaphor. Actually, our friend and colleague Paul Atkins uses it in one of his articles. Imagine someone wrote a nutrition book, and it was all about porridge. And at the end, they describe the last paragraph, they describe that, of course, a healthy diet requires a diverse diet. But the book is all about porridge. And so it's a matter, in so much of this is a matter of emphasis, that and you can try to carve it up into camps. There certainly people have done their best to kind of tribalize this or diffuse that. On the ground, when you're talking to individual scientists, people's views vary much more widely than any kind of tribal camp. And I would also just add that this creates a huge problem for us as educators, because what happens then is, because this is controversial, so to speak, and because sometimes creationists will try to use this to say that there's cracks in evolutionary theory, it winds up getting not taught at all. And so what we've worked really hard to do is cut away at the controversy and think about what conceptual value can be made for general education. And that's what our our conceptual clarification preprint is all about. So there is actually so much agreement if you cut away from claims or particular papers and look at just certain kinds of causal models, such as the role of behavior as selection pressure, as just one example. Or the
let's just dwell on that one for a minute, because that history is so interesting that begins with Baldwin and the Mark Allen Baldwin, was that his full name? In the early 20th century. So in the early 20th century, this idea that learning is like a leading edge of evolution, genetic evolution, and that this in a roundabout way is kind of a little bit Lamarckian, was articulated and regarded as extremely important at the time. But it has always held this marginal role and never really became prominent during the modern synthesis, for example. So the modern synthesis was this hardening around a few key concepts of basically Mendelian genetics. And when philosophers write about syntheses, they talk about this in a positive sense. You just can't be all over the place. So a synthesis highlights some things, some things in the foreground, other things in the background, and that can be helpful for a while. But ultimately, when certain terrain gets explored and the backgrounded things have not been explored, then that's when something new is required. Is it gradual? Is it discontinuous? Whatever. But it wasn't really until the closing decades of the 20th century that the Baldwin effect, which had been there all along, suddenly kind of started to step into the spotlight. And it's such an important concept that the very fact that it's in the spotlight now and was in the shadows before, that's just a historical fact. I don't think any scholar could deny that as a historical fact. And so, we're extending the synthesis. So there we go again.
Yeah, and especially like what we're thinking, why this is especially like important for evolution education to bring this kind of the role of behavior more into the forefront is because this actually attaches much more closely to students' already existing understanding about causality in biology, and it seems to be currently that students' explanations about evolutionary change or the origins of adaptations, whether it's the giraffe snack or whatever, or upright walking, like any behavior, anything that the organism does to in order to do something, well, that's got no role there. That's wrong, and no, it's all about mutations, and that's just not true. Like and so this modern synthesis approach somehow kind of sort of cancels out everything that's sort of happening in between, and kind of wants to just kind of present a very rough narrative. But then the problem is it's taken as this is the true narrative, and then educators and students and everyone is kind of left with this irreconcilable thing between, okay, what we all experience, what's going on in organism behavior and how we react to the world and how we adapt during our lifetime, and we can use that word, and then what is supposed to be the actual evolutionary account of change. And so this modern or this evolution, this extended synthesis kind of ideas to bring this more in the forefront, it's like a great opportunity, at least we think, for evolution education, because you can then now actually combine these ideas and create a more full causal account that is actually closer to the truth.
Or maybe I can give just a concrete classroom example of what this looks like in mainstream evolution education versus the kind of classrooms that we're developing. So there's an article, I won't give the reference here, but in which so biology educators are trained that students may have Lamarckian-like conceptions that intentions or needs, wants, or preferences may drive evolution. And while the discussion in the evolution education literature is pretty complicated, what teachers wind up getting is don't allow that. Reemphasize that it's random genetic mutation. So in one peer-reviewed article for evolution education, a teacher has students read their evolutionary explanations of a trait and he has the students boo the other students anytime they use the word neat. No, we right. It would be laughable, but it's laughable for the students.
There's science education for you,
and
there's doctrine. There's indoctrination for you.
Exactly, and so compare that with what we're doing. One of the preprints we have available now, which was rejected as we were just discussing from a mainstream evolution education journal. What this does is provide causal mapping tools. So it allows students, so needs, wants, preferences, even intentional behaviors, these don't cause evolutionary change in a direct sense. They don't alter the genome of the individual, but they do motivate behaviors. And behavior does then function as selection pressure. And so as long as students get the causal arrows, as long as you build up population thinking and you get the causal arrows right about what motivates what and what creates selection pressure on which levels, students then have a tool for proper thinking about the complex causality here. And a gene-centric focus, therefore, kind of robs them of the opportunity to clarify what is an intuitive and actually maybe not incorrect conception. So that's why we're so concerned about the current the lack of paying attention to the EES is actually creating real problems for students.
Yeah, and let's stay with evolutionary science for just a little bit longer and talk about such things as the idea: can evolution have a purpose? Is there any sense in which evolution can be said to be a conscious process? And the modern synthesis was completely strong on that point. No, absolutely not. Evolution has no purpose. It's the first thing you need to know is that it doesn't have a purpose. Mutations are random with respect to what is selected. The only purpose is to become adapted to your immediate environment, is what the modern synthesis said so strongly that it is taught as a taboo. And while it was funny to think of a classroom exercise in which one side of the class boos the other, that's precisely what happens in the actual science part among the scientists, or at the college and graduate part. And the same goes for multi-level selection. I can tell you about that in detail as to the degree to which the idea of group selection was booed, literally and figuratively, for decades. So, and yet, what we've discovered is that in the first place, if you take the Baldwin effect seriously, then what we can say is that that blind process of evolution gives rise to organisms that are purposeful. Nobody can disagree with the fact that organisms are purposeful in how they go about surviving and reproducing. And given the Baldwin effect, that means that some of the purpose that all organisms has kind of rubs off on the evolutionary process. And then if you start talking about cultural evolution, and especially human cultural evolution, it clearly has an intentional component. People formulate targets of selection and then variation and oriented around that target. How about artificial selection? That's purposeful. We intentionally select traits in other species, but it's still a process of evolution. And then when we talk about some evolutionary extended synthesis stuff about directed mutations and all of that cool stuff, there's more purpose in evolution. And so that dogma is still very strong among the scientists, and to fully take on the idea of purpose and consciousness in evolution, that's paradigmatic. I mean, that's not even an extended evolutionary synthesis. That is a new mountain peak that you have to cross a valley to get to.
Yeah, and at one level, it's incredibly complicated, but that's where we developed this causal mapping approach, which is it still can get complicated, but it can also visually represent. It's similar to the way that we draw food webs in to represent ecosystems, but we're able to draw out developmental systems, including preferential or intentional or at least goal-directed behaviors as processes in evolution. And so we think making the causal assumptions clear and explicit, we've found is one kind of pathway, both for scientists. One of the things we do, it's not just about teaching students, but we also are just incredibly fortunate to be able to interact with scientists across the departments in the Max Planck Institute. So geneticists, behavioral ecologists, archaeologists, psychologists in our department. And so we're able to kind of have these discussions about the complex causal models that we're trying to make accessible to students. And I think people in the EES are doing this incredibly well, but it's still not trickling into the as you call it, the science to narrative chain is rusty or broken, I guess.
That's of course, that's when I guess that's where contextual behavioral science also comes in, that makes it then explicit and gives us a model, and evolution science and evolution educators in general about how to make sense of where is the role of purpose in evolutionary change. And
Yeah, so that leads me to make some comments actually on your own approach, which are a little bit critical in a way, but in a very constructive sense. And let me just list them. Now, part of the extended evolutionary synthesis is a much more systemic approach to biology, recognizing that well, everything is complex, but certainly organisms are. And to give this special status to genes, for example, when in fact it's a whole developmental system, is part of what's new that's taking place. And by definition, that's more complex. So kind of an appreciation of complexity is an important part of what needs to be taught. And that's challenging. It's challenging to teach complexity in any form. So I think what's missing from that formulation is that the same elegance and simplicity that we associate with Darwin's theory, and which we continue to associate with genetic evolution, especially such things as adaptationist thinking, that you could actually look at something and you can make very intelligent guesses about it by knowing its evolutionary history. And more generally, Tinbergen's 4 questions, the idea that everything that evolves needs to be addressed from a functional, mechanistic, historical, and developmental perspective. These things which provide an intuitive toolkit, in other words, not complex, but pretty simple toolkit for the study of genetic evolution, can be applied to any evolutionary process. So that if I look at something cultural, or even if I look at something personal, I can employ the same toolkit, and that's simple. Now, so yes, we need to understand complexity and teach it, but at the same time, the simplicity that we associate with Darwin's theory, and which has proven itself for the study of genetic evolution, can prove itself for these other evolutionary processes. So therefore, you don't lose the simplicity. So that is something I think needs to be said, and I think could be stated, I think, more clearly in your own exposition.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially when we're talking to educators who might then still want to cling to the simple because it just feels a little bit more safe or so. But yeah, that's exactly right. And we actually, in our design concept, in our educational work, that's what we're actually trying to do, is to distill what are some actual, like we call them teaching tools, certain teaching strategies, things you can revisit over and over again, to look at things that are otherwise actually complex. And so Tinbergen's questions is definitely one framework that we use implicitly or sometimes explicitly to sort of look at causes of some observed behavior, whether it's some kind of an experiment about human, like there's this ultimatum game from these are kind of experiments where with humans, will humans share something with a stranger, and then we look at the results and then we try to understand, okay, now why do humans behave like this? And so then we ask these questions where we can look at development and all these different kinds of causes. And so that's definitely one thing. And then causal mapping that we just mentioned, that is actually a very relatively simple tool. Yeah, it's just like, educators, they use already different mind maps, concept maps. So it's just kind of like this, just a little bit more repurposed for thinking about causality. And then other little teaching tools. It's just that they're new to educators. They're not used to that. This is now what evolution education could look like, right? It's still mostly there's genes, and then there's Darwin's finches, and then there's the moth. Like these examples are being used over and over for like 20, 30 years already, and we also notice educators are getting a little tired of them. They're thinking, well, this isn't obviously what the science is anymore. And so what we're doing is to kind of develop tools that will make it more simpler and graspable for students and teachers, even though the reality is complex. But that's exactly what is needed, is developing new tools that replace the old tools that made it seem simple.
Yeah, I would just add that that's a common critique of our work is, well, this sounds nice, but maybe for undergraduate, and it's certainly too complex to translate to lower grades. But we actually think that the implications, exactly for the reasons you said, the simplicity, the elegance, the coherence across across contexts and including across disciplines. We're working with a growing number of elementary school educators, middle school educators. We believe that there are significant implications, and it would actually be easier to teach evolution if there was more of a K-12 approach, and a lot of this complexity can be made very accessible to younger grades by simply asking how and why questions, building up schema across ages. And it's precisely because of what you said that there is this simplicity and coherence.
Yeah, and so thank you. I knew that we were on the same page with respect to that. Now, another thing is whether when we talk about non-genetic evolutionary processes, we describe them as analogies to genetic evolution or true blue evolutionary processes, which of course differ from genetic evolution. Mechanisms of inheritance differ from each other, but they still qualify functionally as mechanisms of inheritance. And I think a clear case of that is the adaptive component of the immune system. So that's an evolutionary process built by genetic evolution, but it is certainly a process by which antibodies vary and are selected based on a criterion of selection, which is their ability to bind to antigens. And so all three ingredients of an evolutionary process are there: variation, selection, replication. So it's not an analogy, it's a true blue evolutionary process. And I think the same thing can be said for all the other non-genetic evolutionary processes. They were built by genetic evolution, or more generally, the idea that an evolutionary process can spawn another evolutionary process. That's both true and extremely important because we have to spawn some new cultural evolutionary processes to become adapted to our modern age. But the bottom line, which I'd like to get your comment on, is when we describe these other evolutionary processes, such as computer algorithms or behavioral flexibility, what B.F. Skinner called selection by consequences, or processes of human cultural evolution. Do you think it's important, as I do, to describe these not as analogies, but as actually true blue evolutionary processes with inheritance mechanisms, which, of course, differ from genetic inheritance mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, that gets us, I guess, to me at least, like right back at this kind of philosophy of what is an analogy versus the real thing. And that's kind of what gets back to this kind of ongoing discussion in evolution science, but then also in evolution education, this kind of notion, well, this is what we mean by the real evolution, and this is just kind of an analogy. And so that's, of course, always going to be a philosophical debate where, people might never agree ultimately, because all language is analogy anyway. Like, it's kind of funny, a little bit ironic, like that the term inheritance, right? Obviously, it was kind of hijacked by the modern synthesis from an earlier, everyday use of the term. And now they're using it like, oh, strict, this is what inheritance is. And you can't
Right.
now, students get confused. It also means this. Well, hold on. It does mean this first, and you're using it analogically. And so it's kind of, we get into this mess about what is the real meaning of the word. And so, of course, it's all analogy. And that's kind of a little bit how we see it. But yeah, kind of making this distinction, it's like, I'm not sure if there can ever be any agreement. We just have to agree that it's all analogy somehow.
I would only add that at the level of computational modeling, this does work out. People are able to model cultural evolution just as well as genetic evolution on highly similar models. That gets a little bit above my pay grade to get into the weeds there, but certainly it's the case that that's happening. So at a mathematical level, there is equivalence or congruence of these processes. And then another question is just, what are we looking for out of explanation? How helpful is it? Does it add something to the explanation? Is it just about a preference for calling it evolutionary? And this is where I think the onus is on us as advocates of generalized or interdisciplinary evolution. And I do think that there's value in bridging ideas across the biological and cultural, in providing theoretical perspectives on what kinds of conditions favor cooperation from multiple levels of explanation. In contextual behavioral science, they talk about reticulated theory or a networked theory. It just means if we're trying to explain a phenomena like cooperation, that we need to explain it at multiple levels. We need to build a sort of network of theories from more proximate levels back in time through more phylogenetic, and so for all of these reasons, I think there's value. I think it is scientifically legitimate to describe beyond genetic evolution these other processes as evolutionary, and I think it's helpful. And then when you get into education, I think it's going to be shown to be very helpful.
Yeah, I like what both of you said, especially what Susie said about analogy. No worries. I mean, no shame or no about analogous reasoning. And I actually have an example of that that can segue us into the next segment of our conversation, which is the idea of symbolic thought as an inheritance system. Mm-hmm. And so the evolutionary side of this, which is so darn exciting, is that in the so we have basically in our closest primate relative, chimpanzees, an ape which is very much like us, except much less cooperative. And that's stunning when you read the modern literature, books such as most recently Richard Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox, to learn just how uncooperative and how nasty, basically, chimp society is. A little bit of cooperation, but mostly conflict, violent conflict within communities, 100 to 1,000 times more frequent in a chimp community than in a human community. And even the cooperation that takes place mostly as a form of collective aggression against other communities, the border patrols and things like that. So something happened in human evolution that caused us to become much more cooperative. That was mostly social control. It's called guarded egalitarianism by Christopher Boehm, who's done wonderful work on this subject. The whole concept of moral systems and moral psychology is part of it. But it was only after becoming a highly cooperative species then we could become mentally cooperative, and symbolic thought as a form of mental cooperation. I mean, if you can't maintain an inventory of symbols with shared meanings if you're not cooperative in other respects. So cooperation came first, and then mental cooperation came, then symbolic thought, and that was so such a powerful form of information coding and transmission, that it became a full-blown inheritance system in its own right. So now we have dual inheritance theory, two streams of inheritance, and the symbolic systems having the same kind of combinatorial diversity as genetic systems, an infinitude of symbolic systems, each one motivating a suite of behaviors, just the way our genotypes motivate a suite of phenotypic traits. And so we can begin to think about a symbotype-phenotype relationship. Let's coin a new word. Symbotype is not the same as a meme because it's more systemic. And we can expect a symbotype-phenotype relationship similar to the genotype-phenotype relationship. Now, there's an analogy and a metaphorical transfer that is extremely powerful because people outside of evolution and all the different disciplines, applied and basic disciplines that have been thinking about symbolic thought for a long time, have not been thinking about it this way. So on the one hand, they have much to offer because they've been studying symbolic thought much longer than evolutionists have. And yet, on the other hand, there's this tremendous way of thinking about it that provides just a rich kind of fertilization across disciplines. And that's what's currently happening both in the academic disciplines and in the applied disciplines when we get to evolutionary contextual science. And that, I think, is the next phase of our conversation, that when we go to the people that are actually operating within this new paradigm, then it has all of these applications that are not necessarily educational applications. They're more like practical applications in terms of what we actually do, how we form our societies, and so on. So once again, I have a bad habit of running on. Let me get your comments on this, and we can move into the kind of the pro-social end of things here.
Yeah. So we can stay on the science, but I'll tend to bring it back to an educational context because that's our world. So in addition to thinking about educational content and evolution as a source of educational content, we also think about evolution as a source of educational context and how we can use evolutionary theory to think about how we design schools and classrooms and educational projects, and then in that case, specifically how we can empower students to understand the kinds of processes that you just described. So at the Max Planck Institute, we have a project called the Community Science Lab, where we've been working with this incredible team of eighth graders for the whole school year. We're now trying to transition into post-COVID adaptation, but what we do in this lab is use the pro-social project. So probably many This View of Life listeners know what this is. We can also describe it a little bit, but
I'll do that in just a minute. But
so
keep on going.
What we do is basically find ways to engage students in the science of pro-social, but more so, we're looking at the behavioral, cognitive, and cultural variation, especially around cooperation dynamics in their everyday lives. So earlier in the year, we had been looking at climate change, Fridays for Future movements, and how these kind of cooperation dynamics are working or not working towards different groups' values. And in the last few months, we've been shifting towards looking at the schools themselves as cooperative units, and what kinds of conditions may favor or disfavor different behavioral variants, and how we might think about schools in a different context, both in terms of phylogenetic evolution. What does that tell us about how to design schools, but then also about this more proximate developmental variation, symbolic evolution, if you will. So we're basically trying to develop a more experiential model. It's easy to critique education as not, especially evolution education, as not giving students tools to engage directly. And so what we're trying to do with the Community Science Lab is give them the tools to kind of shape the behavioral variation that affects their own lives. So that may tangentially connect to where you're trying to go.
Yeah, because it's and then we try to use that as a context to then bring the content for what is needed to kind of understand change, understand other people's behaviors, and understand, maybe find out what they actually want, and that needs some content that otherwise the school curriculum doesn't quite give them. And so we're trying to find the right balance between this evolution science, contextual behavioral science, informing both the context, like what can we actually do with this, and then the content, like what do we need to understand to use these tools.
Yeah, so it's so exciting and comprehensible. So the point I want to make is that this new paradigm, let's call it a new paradigm, unabashedly, it's not the evolutionary extended evolutionary synthesis. It's the new evolutionary synthesis will become even more extreme that way, is not future tense. It is present tense for actually a large community, both in the basic science all the way to the applications and its education. And so there are many books, and of course, including my own, starting with Evolution for Everyone and all the way up to my most recent, This View of Life, then explaining this expanded view of evolution. There's book after book after book that are easily read and digested. Awesome basic scientific research in the best journals. And of course, This View of Life, the online magazine, and this podcast is bringing that to a wider audience. And because this expanded view of evolution goes so far beyond genetic evolution, that means it vastly expands the practical applications. Practical applications are no longer restricted to such things as antibiotic resistance and pesticide resistance. The practical applications are everywhere, and that includes K-12 education. So actually, this stuff is being introduced in the classroom, not as like evolution, what we teach the kids about evolution. It's about how the nature of education from an evolutionary perspective. Amazing work about how education, cultural transmission takes place in traditional societies, why modern educational methods have strayed from that. It just goes on and on. That these practical applications. And once we see the practical applications, then of course that provides an enormous incentive to accept it all. It all, because at the end of the day, why do we accept something or reject it? It's on the basis of its perceived implications. If it's threatening, we reject it. If it's alluring, we accept it. Nobody refuses to pick up an important tool. So that's the ultimate decider as to whether you end up believing in evolution or not. It's on the basis of whether you regard it as useful or not. So there's the irony: is that by shying away from this, the old view that sticks to genetic evolution is actually not availing itself of what's going to cause everyone who encounters it basically to embrace evolution when they realize that it's what's needed in order to adapt to our current environments at all scale, which now is, if you didn't appreciate the need for that before, you do now.
That kind of brings us back to our motivation to also write these articles, kind of to put that argument out there, like to kind of just point the evolution education, but also general education community, I guess, sustainability education community, to just look over there where you were before. You thought you were not supposed to look there, but if you just look over there and listen for a moment, this might have all your answers. And so that's
and like I said, there have been years past where it's been not advantageous to our career to try to push this forward, but the potential is so clear. And in the last couple of years, we've made just such great strides by having incredible local partners, teacher partners, that we're just so excited about the potential that can be developed, especially as we get more teachers and more scientists on board with making it happen. So that's what keeps us going.
Yeah, well, that's true. Of course, that's true when you read a book. I mean, I get all kinds of positive feedback from my own books, and I know my colleagues do as well. We have our EVOS programs, evolutionary studies programs, that I started at Binghamton, and there's a good 5 or 6 of them. And there's one thing that all those programs have in common: the students love it.
Yeah, that's right.
Teach an evolution for everyone course, and the students just love it. Student satisfaction is the one constant. And against that background, in your second paper, you cite a study. It's Brehm et al. 2003, I believe, which basically describe that studies because it really shows how traditional evolution education is failing, not just with the creationists, but with like every category of person who encounters it. So it's pretty stark. Please describe that study.
Yeah, it's. We find it also that it kind of encapsulates what is a little bit the problem with evolution education. Like it's by now almost, I think, 20 years ago, like published in 2003, and it was just like I think a small survey among undergraduates somewhere in the US, I'm not sure where, kind of just asking students across a wide range of beliefs, also from creationist all the way to not non-theistic or what do they think? What are the implications of evolutionary theory, sort of in diverse areas of life, like kind of things like, do they think evolutionary theory justifies or implies selfishness, implies racism, diminishes sense of purpose, diminishes self-determination, and somewhat along these lines. And the results were like overwhelmingly, like more than 80% of students across all beliefs and even across all areas of evolution understanding, in quotation marks. We'll put it in quotation marks because we don't necessarily agree that this is the real understanding that they're measuring there. But across all of those student groups, overwhelmingly negative sort of associations with evolutionary theory, that it leads to selfishness and diminishes sense of purpose. And so that for us, like, we like that study because we can cite it to show, well, to kind of encapsulates kind of what seems to be the problem that seems to be still not solved. Like the community is still grappling with these problems, and we're just saying, well, if you just look over there, maybe that's the way to solve it.
Or I can also give one other example from soon to be published work from our own effort. We developed an activity where we engaged students and teachers in recent research from the Max Planck Institute, from Mike Tomasello's lab when he was here, and it was a comparative research between 6-year-old human children and mature chimpanzees. And they were engaged, pairs of children and pairs of chimpanzees were engaged in similar cooperation tasks. And so what we did was explain to students in grades 6 through 12, and then also practicing biology teachers, we would explain the setup to them of this comparative research and say, who do you think would do better at this cooperation task, and how do you think they would behave? And so overwhelmingly, we find that people choose the chimpanzee, that they think chimpanzee will be the cooperative species, and that children will not be, because children are humans and humans are selfish animals. Tellingly, the 6th graders give this response at a rate of about 60-40. So about 40% of them will say that the children will do well. When you talk to biology teachers, it gets up more to like 95 to 100% will say that the chimpanzee are the cooperative species. So the thing about German biology education is kind of
stupid. Or
well, we call it the Jane Goodall effect. We think that in essence Jane Goodall, for all the wonderful things that she's done, kind of the lasting cultural legacy is that chimps are more human than we thought. Chimps are better than we thought.
Well, I mean, you should call it the Rousseau effect, because I mean, it's basically the kind of a noble savage narrative.
Yeah.
Right. You quote from this Brehm paper conclude, while we would hope that knowing more about evolution would lead to a richer understanding of complicated issues, these results suggest that the more a person knows about evolution, the more negative they become. And that is not restricted to creationists, folks.
Yeah.
That's across a broad swath
Yeah.
of people. That's our problem.
And this is 17 years ago, and this is a persistent problem that evolution education has yet to address, and that's why we need new thinking.
Yeah, and that's why.
Well, I had the honor of. Go ahead, Susie.
Well, just kind of to reiterate, that's why we're saying, well, maybe you should look at how you are actually measuring understanding. Maybe you should change something there, and that's just one note.
Yeah. I had the honor of a conversation with His Holiness the Dalai Lama last fall, and I began it by saying that when I entered the field of evolution in the 1970s, for everyone, we could thought about evolution this way. First of all, it's just about genetic evolution. Secondly, evolution has no purpose. And third, evolution is all about selfishness. Mm-hmm. And think of how barren territory that is from the standpoint of, for example, Buddhist thought. Mm-hmm. Now I was able to report that evolution goes way beyond genetic evolution, that evolution can have a purpose, can be conscious, and that evolution explains altruism in addition to selfishness. And so what a more richer territory for exploring all things human, including all things spiritual, than that older view of evolution. Back to the idea that this truly is paradigmatically different. So we've had a great conversation. On my end, I'd like to conclude by saying that, as I often do, that historians will look back upon this period and they'll call it rapid. They'll say that the 21st century was a period of rapid synthesis for human-related knowledge, similar to the synthesis of biological knowledge in the 20th century. And when we look back to the 20th century at what seems rapid in historical hindsight, we see that those controversies took decades to unfold. And now what we're seeing is change which is decadal, therefore seems slow to the participants, but historians will look back upon them as fast. But they really need to become faster and can become faster. So if we know what to do, we can catalyze this new synthesis. We can cause it to become more common in a matter of years, not decades. And we literally need to do so because it does contain the solutions to our problems. Guess what? Scientific understanding of evolution is needed to manage cultural and personal change. And you can only do that if you're operating within this new paradigm. So that's my final statement. And now you get to take your turns.
And I agree with this statement, and that's why I do what I do. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think we both couldn't agree more, and that's what keeps us going. And I guess we just hope that some of the kind of disciplinary tribalism or barriers to thinking at the level of science and certainly then at the level of education can kind of be loosened so that we can take advantage of this, because it's these barriers that are preventing students from learning the science that they can access but aren't being enabled to because of this kind of bickering at the higher level.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All the way up to the top. So, but it is present tense for us and a sizable community. And so, isn't that great to know that for someone who's basically hasn't learned about this, it's like going through a portal, and there'll be a community, a rich community with so much to read, and it makes me proud that this view of life, that phrase, Darwin's concluding phrase in The Origin of Species, there is grandeur in this view of life, is being communicated in these podcasts and in the online magazine and to my best of my ability in my books and many, many other sources where you can rapidly become a part of this. And so you're doing such a great job at this, and I'm very happy to feature your work in this podcast.
Great. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
All righty. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to This View of Life. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review to help others find the show. This View of Life is produced by the Evolution Institute, a nonprofit think tank whose mission is to provide science-based solutions for today's most pressing social issues in order to improve the quality of life. Learn more at evolution-institute.org. And if this view of life is important to you, then type TVOL 1000, TVOL 1000, to see how you can join the Darwinian Revolution.